Welcome to the Volpe Report podcast, the state's premier public affairs show dedicated to the topics that matter most to Pennsylvanians. I'm your host, Chuck Volpe. Join us now as we speak to this week's guest.
The following half-hour show is a paid political program and is not endorsed by this station, management, or staff.
The following program is sponsored by Excalibur Insurance Management Services.
In this all-important show, as we are now 2 days out from the election, I have spent really the last better part of the month on the national scene talking about the presidential race, as you're all well aware. So I thought from whence we came, we would go back in this last show before Tuesday and talk about the very important United States Senate race in Pennsylvania. As you've heard, I'm sure ad nauseum, that Pennsylvania is a huge, important state, a swing state. It's a swing state for a presidential election. It often determines who the president will be. It's also a swing state for majority in the Senate, which we have a very important nationally highlighted race, as you're all well aware. Three-term incumbent United States Democratic Senator Bob Casey against the Republican challenger, West Point graduate, decorated Airborne Ranger, Dave McCormick. So in this important race, we are having one last word from Dave McCormick. He's been a multiple guest on this show from his run for Senate 2 years ago to right up until today. So he makes his case for United States Senate, talking about the issues that he's been hammering. I know we've all seen a gazillion commercials, especially in the presidential and U.S. Senate race, and both candidates have made their pitch. So I thought it very appropriate to have a more impersonal 30-minute interview to talk about some of the issues that are important to him, that he wants to make his case, that I know will be important to you. So without any further ado, again, we have Dave McCormick, the Republican nominee for United States Senate, will be our guest today, and we'll go through the issues that matter to you.
This is the Volpe Report, a weekly news and political interview show examining the latest local, state, and national issues with Chuck Volpe. Insightful, informative, controversial. The area's premier political talk show, the Volpe Report.
Dave, welcome back to the Volpe Report.
Hey, great to be with you, Chuck. Thanks for having me.
You know, maybe it's my age, Dave, but I occasionally find my mind going on, not Biden, by the way, when it wanders, but you know, like not a trip down memory lane, but, you know, looking at you across from me now, I sense I'm on the verge of talking to a United States Senator, the momentum, everything that appears there. And we go back a little ways. I mean, in a short period of time, we put some miles together. And I mentioned Foxhole the other day. I remember vividly you being in such a knockdown, drag-out primary with Dr. Oz. And he didn't want to come on this show, but you and I became friends because you took up all his spots and were on the show multiple times. And I remember vividly you sitting next to me and you were promoting your book that you had talked about, you know, kind of a reflection on what was wrong with our country, where it was heading. A prescient book, by the way, because a lot of that you had talked about has come true, come home in spades, really. And then there was the primary where you're pretty much unopposed. And then you led off my fall season with a double show, actually. So now I look at you here. We're really on the cusp of the election. We're 2 days away. I'm sure you and your family is like, thank God the finish line, right? It's here. But I also know I was an old cross-country runner in high school, and I also know you run past the tape until you collapse. And knowing and having talked to you throughout this process, you are clearly doing that. You're everywhere all the time, hitting it hard. So take it from there and kind of tell us where you're at now. The momentum is palpable.
Yeah. Well, thanks again for having me. And I feel honored. That's my honest reflection. I feel honored to be where I am, honored to have the potential opportunity to represent the people of our great Commonwealth. And I'm excited about it. I feel like what's happened in the last 60, 90 days is the parameters of the race have become clear. And I think this is a choice. It's a very dramatic choice between a guy who's been a career politician for 30 years, Senator Casey, 18 years in the Senate, And I don't mean this disrespectfully, but when you look to his record, you will not see a guy who has accomplished anything. He's not have a record of accomplishment. And yet he's voted 99% of the time with an increasingly extreme liberal agenda. He's voted for things like sanctuary cities. He's voted against the Border Patrol. He's voted against law and order. He's voted for defunding the police. He's voted for women or men being able to compete in women's sports. So those positions are really out of touch with Pennsylvania. And so he represents not only the status quo, but an increasingly liberal Democratic Party. And he's competing against, this race is really a contest between that and a guy who's a seventh generation Pennsylvanian, someone who had the opportunity to go to West Point, go to Ranger School, serve his country in the 82nd Airborne Division, combat tour in Iraq, came back to Pennsylvania. I ran a business that created hundreds of jobs, and I'm an outsider. And so the election's really coming down to a simple choice between change and the status quo. And I believe that people want change. And I think what's happened is people are seeing that, and that's why I think I have the momentum, and I'm excited about it. It's like you said, don't take anything for granted. I'm the underdog in this race. So I'm fighting for every single vote. And by the way, Chuck, you and I have talked about this. I'm not fighting for just Republican votes. I obviously am a Republican. I'm a conservative, but I'm seeking the opportunity to represent every single Pennsylvanian, Republican, Democrat, Independent, even those who don't vote for me. I want to solve problems on behalf of every Pennsylvanian. So I'm excited about to your race metaphor. It feels like a marathon. I feel like we're turning the corner.
You finished one and you ran right into the next one.
Exactly. And I'd say it's like any marathon. I think I'm ready for it to be done, but I got a lot of juice right now. I got a lot of energy. I'm getting energy from the people on the ground. It feels like we got a real movement underway here. And so I'm going to run through the tape.
Well, on the front of good news, also, the momentum generated by President Trump, I can't remember like when I've seen the excitement. Like I would literally like make the connection all the way back to like John F. Kennedy when he came through Pennsylvania. I know you saw what I saw yesterday at Madison Square Garden, and the juxtaposition of Kamala Harris's crowds, where they're mostly empty, unless she has performers like Beyonce, and you saw what happened to her, right? I mean, when Beyonce didn't perform, they all left because they were only there to see. And then there's Donald Trump filling Madison Square Garden, almost 20,000 people packed in, but a couple 100,000 out all the way back to Times Square. They showed the shot from the street. So the momentum feels real, Dave. And I mentioned Donald Trump, but let me talk about Dave McCormick in Pennsylvania, because you're generating the same kind of momentum. And I did a quick thing yesterday. Well, it wasn't a quick. I had the Republican National Chairman, Mike Watt. He was my guest yesterday. We talked about the polls, and your race was highlighted by him, by the way. So at any rate, and the polls and what they're doing, the momentum we talked about, I did a view at the end, and it would have been my closing argument to why I effectively didn't go anywhere. The party left me. For 8 minutes, I looked into the camera and talked about how I was a John F. Kennedy Democrat and the values he espoused. Now, tying that to your race, let me draw a comparison here. And let me be clear, I already said Bob on a personal level is a friend of mine. Our families go way back. His father and my father were close politically. But looking at how the times have changed, his father, then governor of Pennsylvania, stood astride of the Democratic Party when it went too far to the left. Famously, was kicked out of the Democratic National Convention in Madison Square. It was right in New York City, by the way. And I was running for governor of Pennsylvania, the youngest ever at that time. I had an event for all of Pennsylvania's delegation in the hotel across from the convention, the conference site of the convention. But the story that whole time was how Bill Clinton, the Democratic nominee, would not let Robert P. Casey, governor of Pennsylvania, speak because he had a position the party wouldn't countenance, and they basically censored him. There's your seeds of censorship 32 years ago, and tying it to your race, I don't see that. I like him on a personal level, but I don't see him telling his party, stop at work, as William F. Buckley famously said. So go ahead.
It's the opposite, Chuck. I mean, I think what you have here is, just stepping back, I think the decision to select Kamala Harris as the nominee, I think Pennsylvania may be the one place where that was a much worse decision for the Democrats, because, whatever you say about Joe Biden, he had ties to Pennsylvania. Scranton Joe, he had campaigned for office here for 50 years, Pennsylvania's third senator. He knew every county commissioner, he knew every union leader. Kamala Harris, to your point, is a radical San Francisco liberal. I mean, listen, her positions, this is not Dave McCormick talking. In her own words, she wants to ban fracking, transition energy workers, mandatory buybacks of your guns, sanctuary cities, citizenship for illegal immigrants, federal benefits. I mean, the one that really gets my friends in Bloomsburg, she wants to reduce your red meat consumption. So these positions may make sense for liberal San Francisco. They are out of step with Pennsylvania. I don't think there's any issue that represents this more clearly, of this liberal extreme ideology, or is more important to Pennsylvania than energy. Couldn't be more important, Chuck. And
the country, Dave, and the nation, and our brothers and sisters in arms in NATO and Europe and everywhere else. But sorry to interrupt.
Exactly. No, and this is a place where of the many bad policies of the Biden-Harris-Casey regime, I think energy is the most clear cut, where you've got this extremism. And let me just paint the picture as I see it. You have essentially a set of policies explicitly meant to dramatically reduce fossil fuel consumption by subsidizing, by putting red tape, bureaucracy, EPA mandates, and subsidizing to a tune of hundreds of billions of dollars, electric vehicles, solar panels, windmills. Okay. Now, that had a number of bad consequences. First of all, that's the source of inflation. All this overspending is what drove up these prices that are killing working families. Second, it hurt Pennsylvania jobs, right? The natural gas industry in particular, in Scranton, it is fantastically important to Northeast Pennsylvania, Southwest Pennsylvania, 100,000 fracking jobs, 300,000 jobs supporting fracking. That should be 1.2 million, 1.5 million. We have unlimited natural gas under our feet. We're the fourth largest natural gas reserves in the world. So when people say to me, what's Pennsylvania's future? Energy is the long pole in the tent of Pennsylvania's energy future. But here's the other thing about it. It's key to our national security. By being energy independent, by having the rest of the world depend on us for energy, that gives us much more power. And finally, it's critical for our environment. So the path to reducing carbon emissions, I believe climate change is a real thing. I think that's something we have to have concerns about. I think human activity contributes to it. The way to reduce that is to have our natural gas exported around the world. We've reduced carbon emissions in the United States by 15% over the last decade because of the fracking revolution. Right. Final point, Chuck, which is so crazy. For all those electric vehicles and solar panels, they're made in China. So at a time when China is our biggest adversary, 70% of the lithium batteries, 70% of the solar panels are made in China. So we're making ourselves more dependent on our primary adversary. This is where Senator Casey has been at his weakest. He supported cap and trade. He supported the regional green gas house.
Reggie, known as Reggie.
Reggie, he supported the Clean Power Act. He supported the EPA mandates where 70% of vehicles by 2032 have to be electric vehicles. This is a guy, you don't have to ban fracking to ban fracking. You just get big government, red tape, bureaucracy, mandates. Bob Casey's a foe, not a friend of our energy sector. And under Kamala Harris and Bob Casey, we will destroy what is critical to Pennsylvania's future.
Look at what they did. Kamala Harris and Gavin Newsom, her brother-in-arms in California. Look at how their Green New Deal, because they're really about a decade ahead of the rest of America, because they've been putting these draconian principles you've talked about in place. Do you know how many power outages, Dave, in the last 12 months in California that shut the state completely down? People with cars were told you can't charge or drive them 3 days a week. They were effectively, their cars, they had no form of transportation because they had no energy. They were dark. That's what they wish for the rest of this country. Yeah. And let me get one. I'm sorry, go ahead.
You're right. No, you're right. You're right. We need baseload energy, baseload, natural gas, coal, all of that creates the baseload. Solar and wind is intermittent.
Right.
Nuclear, by the way, nuclear, I am a strong proponent of nuclear, and Pennsylvania should embrace nuclear energy. If you have natural gas, coal, nuclear, you've got this great baseload. And what's happening, Chuck, with big data, artificial intelligence, our energy needs are going to triple at a time where we're having power outages in California now. We will have those in the United States if the Democrats get their way, because there's no dependency. There's no dependence. There's no consistency with wind and solar, as you say.
Well, let me talk about another thing relative to the adversary in China that we face. I read a great editorial, I want to say, Dave, in the Washington Examiner. They were documenting the issues, and one of the issues they talked about that no one talks about, and I may be scaring people right now, maybe it's a good thing if they get a little scared. You know that treasured Apple phone, smartphone everybody walks around with? You know that key components in that phone are China-made? And let me go further. The analogy they make, you saw what the Israeli intelligence did, taking out Hezbollah. By the way, I was cheering them on, so you know.
Me too.
But blowing up their phones. But the point of the article was, if they have that capability, they would know, based on all the materials in our phones that they're providing, if there was a way to blow up American phones, if we were at war, that would be another existential threat to our national security. You know, so again, back to all of the points you're making, we need to do a 180 pivot and go on, quote, on offense on China.
Yeah, no doubt about it, Chuck. And, you know, this is one of the, you know, you and I spoke about this. I mean, Senator Casey is an 18-year incumbent. He's the best funded candidate in the country. He's outspending me by a lot. And, you know, 90% of his campaign is attacking me. One of the areas is China. But oddly, Senator Casey's got a very mixed record on China. So Senator Casey, is the treasurer, invested $30 million in China Mobile, which is very tied to the Communist Party. He's invested in Chinese power companies personally. He's given the Chinese hundreds of billions of dollars of business for these subsidized industries that come at the expense of Pennsylvania workers. And what he hasn't done is what I'll do in the Senate, which is have a real strategy for reducing our dependence on China. You are absolutely right. There's two things we need to do. Number one, we're still dependent on China, right? Despite all the things we've learned. In COVID, we saw that our pharmaceutical supply chain was dependent on China. We saw that semiconductors, to your point around phones, the reason you couldn't get a pickup truck during COVID was because the semiconductors were outside the United States, made in Taiwan, which is 90 miles away from mainland China. And we were dependent on those supply chains. We've got to bring those critical supply chains home. And we can't have dependency on China for those things. So I agree with you 100%. Second thing we need to do is we need to make sure that no business that does business in China is doing business in a way that's helping the Chinese military, helping the Communist Party, helping the terrible human rights abuses. So we've got to put very severe restrictions on outbound investment to make sure, and the government needs to do this, to make sure we're not helping China's rise to compete against us. And Bob Casey, despite all his talk and all his ads, has been in the Senate for 18 years during a period where, particularly after President Xi came into power, that China was clearly a foe, and he's not done anything. And we need a senator that knows how to do it. And as a guy who's a combat veteran, as a guy who's negotiated against the Chinese in the government on very sensitive issues around technology, I'm going to be a strong voice for that in the Senate.
Well, I found it interesting and even funny, and then we need to move off China. But one thing I will also say is, there's a big debate in this country about TikTok, and it's owned by a Chinese company with direct ties to the communist ruling party in China, which should give pause to America. But what I didn't know, Dave, China banned TikTok for Chinese citizens. Can you imagine it? Can you imagine
you
it?
Can't make.
No,
you can't make it up. I've been in favor of divesting. Americans should divest from TikTok. We should not have TikTok being our Chinese should divest from TikTok. If American investors are going to own TikTok, it's got to be an American company, or we cannot have TikTok in the United States owned by the Chinese.
Right.
And the reason is just the pervasive threat that you mentioned. And we see this in a variety of different ways, and we need to take action. China is very smart. They're very systematic about how they're undermining U.S. interests. I'm going to give you an example, which will seem a little far-fetched, but it'll bring it home, Chuck. I've been down to the border twice now in the last 2 years. I've been there more than the borders are, Vice President Harris, more than Bob Casey, to my knowledge.
Well, I've been there as much as the borders are, so not at all. But go ahead.
If Bob Casey's been there, it hasn't been for a decade. So we have this enormous crisis. So I'm at 2 a.m, Chuck, 2 a.m. with the Border Patrol, Yuma, Arizona. There's a huge wall. The wall stops because President Biden stopped on his first day. 300 yards away is a storage area where you have stacks of steel. We paid for the steel. We paid for the labor. Biden stopped on day one. Senator Casey supported stopping the wall, said the wall is important to security, despite just recently running a commercial saying how tough he was on border security with the wall behind him. But in the middle of the night at 2 a.m, 50 people walk across the border, Chuck, and get processed by the Border Patrol. I personally am standing there. 5 of them are Chinese nationals, right? The Chinese government is infiltrating us every day. The wide open borders are contributing to it. They're infiltrating us with these Confucian institutes. They're infiltrating us with TikTok. And it all is part of a broader strategy to undermine America, undermine our interests, and replace America as the global superpower. And you mentioned the book. That was what my book was about. Superpower in Peril.
Exactly.
Is about the strategy we need for economic and military strength to combat China. It's also the kind of senator we need from Pennsylvania, someone who's going to fight to make sure that we check China. And the way to do that is to be an economic powerhouse with energy, manufacturing. Pennsylvania should be at the heart of that strategy. We just need leadership. And Senator Casey's just been weak. He's not been a leader.
I believe we are going to continue to pay a direct price in the years ahead for the ones that already are there. There's going to be terrorist attacks in this country and other places. I mean, when is enough enough? Really?
Chuck, you're right. 10 million, conservatively 10 million illegal immigrants have entered our country under the failed policies of Biden, Harris, and Casey. And Senator Casey's been with them every step of the way. He owns this crisis. But let me just point to 3 risks. 3 risks. Number one is the one you said. Last year alone, 200 people were apprehended that were on the terrorist watch list. In that middle of the night, when I saw the 50 people, 5 of them were military-age men from Syria, right? So they are here. They are embedded. It took 13 people to take down 2 towers on 9/11. That is what we're up against. So number one, huge embedded terrorist threat. Number 2, this is data from the Department of Homeland Security. It came out a couple of weeks ago, Chuck. My team showed me. I saw it on Fox News. I said, I do not believe this. Show me the data. Show me the memo. There's a memo from Department of Homeland Security in response to a congressional inquiry. Since Biden came into office, 28,000 convicted murderers and rapists, people who were convicted in their home countries, have been knowingly released in the United States. I mean, you can't imagine this. Here's the final one. The thing that Dean and I, my wife and I, have done in the last couple months, we've met with fentanyl families. We've sat down with the parents. Chuck, it is like someone reaches down your throat, pulls out your heart when you hear about these beautiful children dying from fentanyl poisoning. Most of them didn't even know they were ingesting fentanyl. It's 4,000 Pennsylvanians last year. It's 116,000 4,000 Pennsylvanians last year, 116,000 Americans. So let me put that in perspective for you, Chuck. You and I both remember the Vietnam War. We lost 58,000 Americans in 8 years of war, killed in action. We had 2 Vietnams last year in America from fentanyl, from these cartels coming across our border, pushing these drugs into our communities. This is a crisis beyond imagination. It's just not talked about. It's not. We don't have any leadership. So on the first day in the Senate, you got to have 3 things you do here. Number one, you got to eliminate the supply. I would vote to designate the cartels a terrorist organization, send our drones and our special operations across the border, destroy the manufacturing facilities, destroy the distribution networks, take out the cartels. That's number one. Build the wall, borders, give the border patrol the funding they need. We've got to stop the supply. Second, we got to stop the demand. Huge mental health crisis, huge addiction crisis. We got to get the federal government involved in helping stem this addiction. It's horrible, and it's directly tied to the mental health crisis we have in our country. And third, you got to have a harm reduction. We got to have the tools with our early responders. I was in with an early responder earlier this week. The Philadelphia firefighters and early responders endorsed me. 4,000 early responders and firefighters endorsed me. And when I did the press conference, one of the guys with me was from Kensington, who goes in there into these drug-infested communities, and the early responders are at risk because they don't have the right medicines and tools, and like Narcan, and the patients are at risk. We could save a lot more lives if we had the right harm reduction response. We haven't had it under Senator Casey, and we'll have it under me.
Yeah, and I have to, as we run short on time, Dave, I have to also point out, I've seen some of your spots. You mentioned about the people that have endorsed you, the organization, the first responders and all that. But, more relative to specific law enforcement, crime enforcement, that's a pretty impressive spot with all of the basically all of law enforcement in Pennselsvania, including the state police. You're standing there with all of them. I liked how you ended it about how normally they say, I approve this ad. I think, what'd you say? I most sure definitely, approve that ad.
You bet. Well, listen, I was proud of that one. I've got a lot of friends growing up that are at law enforcement, but that was a big deal because it was 44,000 members of law enforcement, the FOP, and they had endorsed Senator Casey before, and they switched their endorsement. And the reason is they know I'll have their backs. We can't defund the police. We have to fund the police. Law and order is the foundation of a community. We got to give them qualified immunity. We got to make sure that their pensions are reasonable. I have worn a uniform. It's a different uniform, but I think people in uniform I know what it's like to have people have your back. I use the GI Bill. I mean, I came back from Iraq. I appreciate what it's like to put yourself out there, put your life at risk for your country or your community. And that's what I'll do as a senator. I'll stand with those guys, strong, those men and women. We got a huge crisis in law enforcement. We got a huge crisis in crime because of guys like Larry Krasner, the district attorney in Philadelphia. They need somebody who's going to have their back, and I'll have it. And I'll have all of Pennsylvania's back if I have the good fortune of and the honor to represent the people in this great Commonwealth.
Well, normally, Dave, I like to use the last minute or so to let the candidate make a closing statement. I'll be honest with you. You made it. You made it. So I wish you obviously great luck and good fortune. I know you must be encouraged because in the previous elections, since we went to mail-in balloting, the Democrats in Pennsylvania have enjoyed a huge, by huge I mean 800,000 to 1 million vote advantage going into election day with the early voting. And my understanding is we're almost in a dead heat in Pennsylvania, which means that 800,000 lead is down to now we're starting almost from zero going into election day, which the analysts are saying bode well for Republicans in Pennsylvania.
Mail-in ballots can be a lot closer. But listen, in the end, this is bigger than any one of us. This is about the future of America, the future of our great Commonwealth. It's a choice between change, which I represent, versus the status quo of weakness and failure that Senator Casey represents. And I'll end with just who I am and what I'm about, which is duty on our country. That's what I learned at West Point. It's how I've lived my life. I'd be honored to represent your viewers and all Pennsylvania. And Chuck, you're always a good friend, and I'm grateful to be on your show. Thank you.
Right back at you. Godspeed, Dave. Good luck.
Yes, sir.
Thanks for joining us for this edition of the Volpe Report podcast. Be sure to visit our YouTube and Facebook pages for upcoming episodes. You can catch up on the Volpe Report podcast on your favorite podcast provider.